It is February 2007, a small town in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Durango, Mexico. A teenage girl in a white gown is standing on a wooden stage at a local festival called the Coffee and Guava Fair. She is 17 years old. Around her, men with firearms stand at the edges of the crowd. Not because anything is wrong, but because this is simply how certain events are attended in this part of Mexico. Her name is Emma Coronel Aispuro. She has just been crowned Queen of the festival. In the audience watching is a man in his late 40s. He is heavyset, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man who would not draw attention in any ordinary room. His name is Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera. At this moment, the United States government has placed a $5 million bounty on his head. Interpol has an active notice. The DEA considers him among the most dangerous men alive. He is watching a 17-year-old girl receive a paper crown at a regional fair in the mountains. Within months, they will be engaged. What follows is not a story about villainy or glamour, though both will appear. It is a story about what happens to a person when their life is decided early, by family, by geography, by the gravitational pull of a man who bends everything around him. Emma Coronel would spend the next 15 years inside a world that offered extraordinary material comfort and almost no personal freedom. She would be dressed, positioned, photographed, and eventually charged. Whether she understood the terms of her life and when is the question that runs underneath everything that follows. The Sierra Madre Occidental runs like a spine through the western edge of Mexico, a range of mountains so remote in places that entire communities develop for generations, with almost no contact with federal institutions. No consistent law enforcement, no reliable courts, no government presence that meant anything in daily life. What filled that absence across decades was something else entirely. In Zunza, the small municipality in Durango where Emma Coronel Aispuro was born in 1989, sits in this geography. It is not a place that appears in tourism literature. It is not a place with much written about it at all. What is known is the landscape, high altitude, isolated, the kind of terrain where roads end and trails begin, where outsiders do not arrive by accident. And what is also known is that this region, specifically the triangle of land touching Durango, Sinaloa, and Chihuahua, known as the Golden Triangle, has been the primary cultivation ground for Mexican opium and marijuana for the better part of a century. Emma was not born into poverty. That distinction matters. Her family was not desperate or marginalized in the way that cartel recruitment narratives often describe. Her father, Inez Coronel Barreras, was already an established figure within Sinaloa cartel networks by the time Emma was a child. He was not a distant associate or a peripheral contact. He was an operator, a man who moved product and managed relationships within the organization that Joaquin Guzman was ascending to lead. Emma grew up in a household where cartel affiliation was not a secret kept from children. It was the architecture of daily life. This matters because it removes a particular kind of innocence from the story before the story properly begins. Emma did not stumble into this world as a young woman seduced by wealth or deceived by a charming older man, though that version has been written many times. She was raised inside it. The language of the cartel, its loyalties, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules about what you say and to whom, was something she absorbed the way children absorb any language. Not by being taught it formally, but by living inside it until it became natural. Her uncle, Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, known as Nacho Coronel, was one of the most senior figures in the Sinaloa cartel. He was considered part of the organization's inner leadership, a man who operated at the level where decisions about territories, alliances, and violence were made. He was killed by Mexican military forces in 2010, a death that would send tremors through the organization and through the Coronel family privately. But in Emma's childhood, he was simply a powerful relative, the kind whose presence at a family gathering meant armed men stood outside. Growing up with that as a backdrop does not make a child cynical or hardened necessarily. Children normalize what surrounds them. What it does is remove certain questions from the table. Questions like whether this life is chosen, whether other lives are possible, whether the men in the family who carry weapons and speak in careful tones about business are doing something that could end badly. Those questions were not available to Emma in the way they might be to a child raised elsewhere. The world she inhabited had its own internal logic, its own code of what was expected and what was dangerous. And that code had nothing to do with federal law or outside moral frameworks. She attended school in the region. Accounts of her childhood are sparse, not because they were hidden exactly, but because no one was documenting the early life of a cartel lieutenant's daughter in a remote mountain community in Durango. What surfaces later in court documents and journalistic reconstructions is a portrait of a girl who was, by the accounts of people who knew her then, considered unusually beautiful, socially composed, and already aware of the weight her family name carried in certain rooms. That awareness of what a name means, of how it opens and closes doors, of what is owed to it and what it demands, is something that shaped Emma long before Joaquin Guzman ever saw her on a stage. She had been living inside a named family in a specific world. The name required comportment. It required a particular kind of silence. It required that you understand, without being told directly, that certain things are not discussed and certain people are not questioned. By the time she was a teenager, Emma Coronel was already fluent in these requirements. She had grown up watching women in her family navigate proximity to powerful men, how they dressed for certain occasions, how they behaved in public versus private, how they managed the gap between what was known and what was said. These were not lessons taught in any formal sense. They were modeled, repeated, absorbed. The Coffee and Guava Fair, yes, in February 2007, was a local tradition in the region, the kind of small-town festival that marks the agricultural calendar and draws families from surrounding communities. The beauty queen competition was a fixture of it. Emma entered. She won. The details of exactly how Joaquin Guzman came to be in that audience on that day have never been fully established in the public record. What is documented is that he was there, that he was accompanied by the kind of security detail that does not blend into a crowd even when it tries, and that his interest in the 17-year-old girl who had just been crowned was noted by people present. In some versions of events, the connection between the Coronel family and Guzman meant that this was not an encounter between strangers. Inés Coronel Barreras and El Chapo operated within the same organizational structure. A meeting between their families was not, in that world, a surprise. What happened after the fair, the courtship, the arrangement, the movement toward marriage, unfolded within a social context where a powerful man expressing interest in a subordinate's daughter carried a specific kind of weight that was not easy to refuse, regardless of what anyone privately felt. Emma would have understood that, not as a threat, not necessarily as a tragedy, but as the kind of thing that happens in this world, the world she had been raised inside. And that is handled in a particular way, with composure, with the right kind of public face, without the questions that the situation might generate from the outside. She was 17. He was 49. The engagement followed. The wedding took place on July 2nd, 2007. Emma Coronel had turned 18 3 days earlier, on June 29th. The timing has been noted in various accounts without much elaboration, as though it were a bureaucratic coincidence rather than what it more likely was. A practical arrangement ensuring that the marriage would carry legal standing, that no questions about the age of the bride could be raised afterward in any formal proceeding. The ceremony was held in Canelas, a small municipality in Durango, deep in the Sierra Madre. It was not a quiet or private occasion. By multiple accounts, the celebration drew hundreds of guests and lasted through the night. There was music, norteño bands, the kind associated with corridos, the folk ballads that had been celebrating cartel figures in this region for decades, songs that dressed violence in the language of honor and masculinity, and regional pride. There were firearms visible on the men who stood at the perimeter of the celebration. There was food, alcohol, dancing, the outward form of joy. What is also documented is that municipal police in the area were essentially stood down for the duration of the event, not through any formal order, but through the kind of understood pressure that operates in regions where cartel authority has long exceeded the practical reach of local government. Officers who might otherwise have patrolled the roads near Canelas that night were, by various accounts, simply absent. The celebration required that kind of space, and the space was provided without anyone needing to ask twice. The groom was Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera. He was 49 years old, already twice married, already a father multiple times over, already the subject of an escape from a Mexican federal prison in 2001 that had embarrassed the government and elevated his legend to something close to mythological in this part of the country. He had been a fugitive for 6 years by the time he stood beside Emma Coronel at that ceremony. He moved through the world with an infrastructure of loyalty, threat, and bribery so extensive that his physical location at any given moment was known to almost no one and discoverable by almost no government. He was also, by every account, a man who did not tolerate disappointment from the people around him. Emma's father, Inés Coronel Barreras, was present at the wedding. Her uncle Nacho Coronel was present. The gathering was, in one sense, a family event. In another sense, it was an alignment of interests, a consolidation of a relationship between the Coronel family and the man who ran the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere. Marriages in this world are rarely only personal. They carry organizational logic. They bind families to obligations. They create a structure of loyalty that is harder to escape than any formal contract, because it is enforced not by courts, but by something older and more immediate. Whether Emma wanted this marriage, in the sense of having genuinely considered alternatives, weighed her own desires, and arrived at a free decision, is a question the historical record cannot answer cleanly. What can be said is that the conditions under which such a choice would be made freely did not exist in Canelas in July 2007. The social architecture of that world, the position of her father within the organization, the specific nature of Guzman's interest, and the culture of the region all converged in a way that made refusal not simply difficult, but functionally inconceivable. This is not the same as saying Emma was dragged unwillingly to an altar. People raised inside particular worlds often genuinely embrace the options those worlds present to them because those options have been framed since childhood as desirable, as markers of status and security. A man like El Chapo, powerful, wealthy, feared, celebrated in the folk music of the region, was, within the value system Emma had been raised inside, a significant match. Her family's relationship with him elevated their standing. Her role as his wife would come with resources and protections that most women in Durango could not access. But elevation and choice are not the same thing. The weeks following the wedding offer a glimpse of what the marriage's daily reality would immediately become. Guzman was a fugitive. He could not live in a fixed location for extended periods. He moved constantly. Between safe houses, between states, between the mountain terrain, he knew better than any soldier or federal agent sent to find him. Emma, as his new wife, entered a domestic arrangement that had no fixed address, no stable geography, no ordinary rhythm of daily life. She was 18 years old, and her home was wherever her husband's security apparatus determined it was safe to be, for however long it was safe to be there. There are accounts from this period, and some surfacing later in court testimony, others in journalistic reconstructions, of Emma living in a series of properties across Sinaloa and Durango that were maintained not as homes in any conventional sense, but as operational locations. Places where Guzman could receive associates, conduct business, and remain insulated from capture. The domestic and the organizational were not separate in these spaces. The house where Emma prepared meals and eventually cared for children was the same house where cartel business was conducted at a table in the next room, or sometimes the same table. What this meant for Emma's daily experience, the texture of it, the psychological weight of it, is something she has never described in any public forum with any depth. The glimpses available come mostly from what other people have said around her, in court or in interviews, rather than from anything she has chosen to share herself. What is clear is that from the first weeks of her marriage, her movements were controlled not by her own preferences, but by the security requirements of a man who could not move freely in the world. Her freedom of movement was a function of his danger. At some point during the early months of the marriage, Emma became pregnant. The pregnancy would become significant for reasons that were almost certainly strategic before they were personal, a point that belongs to a later part of this story. But in the immediate term, it bound her more firmly to Guzman and to the world she had entered through that wedding in Canelas. A child creates obligations that are harder to walk away from than a marriage ceremony, particularly in a culture where family loyalty is the deepest available form of currency. The norteño bands that played at the wedding had a tradition of singing about men like El Chapo, men who built empires from the mountain soil and could not be caught and died on their own terms rather than the government's. The corridos made this sound like freedom. Standing at a table in a safe house in Sinaloa, 18 years old, already carrying the weight of a name that was not her own, Emma Coronel was learning what that freedom looked like from the inside. It did not look like freedom at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself as loneliness. It wears the appearance of security, of comfort, of being looked after. It has clean rooms and reliable food and people nearby at all hours. What it does not have is the ordinary texture of a life, the ability to make small decisions freely, to leave when you want to leave, to build friendships that are not filtered through someone else's security requirements. Emma Coronel spent the years following her wedding inside this kind of loneliness, and the record of that period is notable mostly for what it does not contain. There are no photographs of Emma from this time that circulated publicly, no social media presence. This was partly the era, partly the operational necessity of a household organized around concealment. There are no interviews, no public appearances, no accounts of her participating in community life in any ordinary sense. She existed, during these years, almost entirely within the private world that Guzman's fugitive status created around anyone close to him. The outside world knew she existed. It knew very little else. Guzman's life as a fugitive had a specific operational logic that had been refined across years of evasion. He maintained multiple properties across Sinaloa and Durango, some modest, some more elaborate, all chosen for defensibility and egress rather than comfort. He traveled with a rotating security detail, men whose loyalty had been cultivated through years of payment and shared risk. He communicated through layers of intermediaries, using encrypted devices and trusted couriers to conduct business without exposing his location. The infrastructure of his survival was sophisticated, expensive, and entirely organized around one priority: keeping him alive and uncaptured. Emma's daily life was nested inside this infrastructure. Where she lived at any given time was determined not by preference, but by assessment. Whether a property had been compromised, whether a location had attracted attention, whether it was time to move. The decision of when to move and where was never hers. It belonged to the security apparatus, which meant it belonged ultimately to Guzman. She was, in a logistical sense, cargo, valuable, protected, but moved according to someone else's calculations. This kind of existence erodes certain capacities quietly: the ability to plan, to make appointments, to commit to being somewhere at a particular time, to build the small architecture of a life around future expectations. Becomes unavailable when your location is subject to change without notice. The ability to maintain friendships requires a stability of contact that the cartel's security requirements did not permit. The women Emma had grown up with in Durango, the cousins and neighbors and schoolmates who formed the social fabric of a young woman's early adult years, were now effectively inaccessible. Not because they had been forbidden exactly, but because contact with people outside the immediate circle carried risk that the organization would not absorb on Emma's behalf. What she had instead was proximity to Guzman himself. When he was present, which was not always, his life required him to move, to attend to organizational matters, to manage the relationships and conflicts that came with running an enterprise of that scale across multiple states and into international supply chains. He was not a man who came home at a regular hour. He was not a man whose whereabouts were reliably communicated to his wife in advance. He appeared and disappeared according to the demands of something much larger than their domestic arrangement, and Emma's role was to be present when he arrived, and to manage his absence without complaint when he did not. The marriage produced twin daughters. Emma Joaquina and Maria Joaquina Guzman Coronel were born on August 15, 2011, at a hospital in Lancaster, California. The choice of location was deliberate. By giving birth on American soil, Emma ensured that her daughters would be born as United States citizens, a status that carried legal protections and future possibilities that Mexican citizenship alone in this context did not. The decision required Emma to travel to California while heavily pregnant, to arrange the birth in a foreign country under circumstances that were logistically complex given who she was and who her husband was. The planning involved required a level of forward calculation that suggests Emma was not simply a passive figure in the management of her family's circumstances, but the nature of that calculation is worth examining. The twins' American citizenship was, in the most immediate sense, an insurance policy. It was a hedge against the futures that were already visible to anyone paying attention. The possibility of Guzman's capture, the collapse of the cartel's protection, the need for a life that could be lived somewhere outside the reach of Mexican federal consequences. Emma was 21 years old when she made this arrangement. She was thinking already about escape routes. Whether she thought of them as escape routes for herself and her daughters or primarily as assets in Guzman's organizational continuity is a question that the decision itself cannot answer. Both motivations could have coexisted. What is clear is that the birth of the twins in California was not a sentimental choice. It was a strategic one. Back in Mexico, the years between the twins' birth and Guzman's eventual capture in 2014 were years of mounting pressure on the Sinaloa cartel from multiple directions. The Mexican military had escalated operations in the Sierra Madre. Rival organizations, particularly the Zetas, were expanding into territories Sinaloa had long controlled. The organizational violence that Guzman had managed through a combination of force and negotiation was becoming harder to contain. His world was getting smaller in ways that the Corridos did not yet reflect. Inside that world, Emma's situation was developing its own specific pressures. The twins were small children, requiring the kind of stable, continuous care that the household's nomadic security requirements made difficult. Guzman was increasingly absent, his attention absorbed by organizational crises that demanded physical movement and constant management. The people around Emma in the safe houses and cartel-maintained properties were not her friends or chosen companions. They were employees, guards, associates whose presence was functional rather than personal. She was, in the most concrete sense, surrounded by people and alone. There is one documented glimpse into the texture of Emma's domestic life during this period that surfaces later, in a context she could not have anticipated. During El Chapo's American federal trial in 2018 and 2019, testimony from various witnesses and evidence submitted by prosecutors included details about the properties Guzman maintained and the people who moved through them. Some of this testimony, almost incidentally, described Emma's presence in these spaces, not as a participant in operational discussions, but as a figure who occupied the domestic interior while the business of the cartel was conducted around her. She fed her daughters. She was there when Guzman arrived and remained when he left. The witnesses who described these scenes were not asked about Emma's emotional state or her relationship with Guzman in any depth. The questions were about logistics, about movements, about evidence. Emma as a person was not what the prosecution was trying to establish. She appeared in the testimony as context, as setting, as part of the background of a man's life that the jury needed to understand in order to convict him. This is how she existed in those years, as background, as the domestic interior of someone else's more visible story. Guzman was arrested on February 22, 2014 in Mazatlan. Mexican Marines entered the condominium where he was staying in the early morning hours and took him into custody without significant resistance. Emma was not present at the arrest. By various accounts, she was elsewhere with the twins when it happened, and the news reached her through the same channels. Cartel communications networks trusted intermediaries that carried all information in that world. Her husband of 7 years was in Mexican federal custody. The infrastructure that had organized her life since she was 18, the safe houses, the security details, the operational logic that determined where she slept and who she saw, had just sustained a blow that would require immediate reorganization. She was 24 years old, the mother of 3-year-old twins, and the world that had been built around her, the one she had never fully chosen, had just become significantly less stable. What she did in the immediate aftermath of that arrest, how she managed the twins in her own circumstances, and the expectations of the organization that now had a significant problem to navigate, is not well documented. But what happens next, What Emma becomes visible doing, publicly, begins to take a shape that suggests she understood, with some clarity, that her role was about to change. The first time most people outside of Sinaloa and the federal court system became aware of Emma Coronel Aispuro as a distinct person, not simply as El Chapo's wife, not simply as a name attached to a more famous name, was in January 2016. Guzman had escaped from Altiplano Federal Prison in July 2015, tunneled out through a mile-long passage that had been constructed over months beneath the shower floor of his cell, and been recaptured 6 months later in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, on January 8, 2016. The recapture drew international press attention of an intensity that the Mexican government had been trying to generate for years. And in the coverage that followed, the photographs, the television footage, the newspaper front pages, Emma began to appear. She was not captured. She was not charged. She appeared voluntarily in public, at court hearings, and in press coverage, dressed in a way that was immediately and widely noted. At the hearings surrounding Guzman's extradition proceedings, Emma arrived in carefully chosen outfits, coordinated colors, fitted silhouettes, understated jewelry, hair and makeup, composed with a precision that read unmistakably as deliberate. She was 26 years old, and she looked, in the photographs that circulated globally, like someone who had been prepared for public attention. The question of who was doing the preparing is not a simple one. Emma has spoken in the limited interviews she has given about making her own choices regarding her appearance. That may be true in the narrow sense. She may have selected the specific garments herself, but the broader construction of her public image during this period carries the marks of something more organized than personal taste. The consistency of the presentation across multiple appearances, the way it calibrated a very specific register, neither flashy nor invisible, composed but not cold, present but not threatening, suggests coordination. Someone or several people had thought carefully about what Emma Coronel should look like to the outside world at this particular moment. That moment was significant. Guzman's extradition to the United States was being negotiated and contested, a process that would take until January 2017 to complete. During this period, his legal team was managing not only the formal legal proceedings, but also the public perception of their client. The narrative around who Joaquin Guzman was, whether he was a monster or a product of circumstance, whether the Mexican government had treated him fairly, whether the United States had legitimate jurisdiction. Emma's public appearances were part of this broader management. A composed, well-dressed young wife attending her husband's hearings communicated something specific, that this was a family, that there were human stakes to what was being decided, that the man in custody had people who loved him. This is not a cynical observation about Emma's feelings for her husband, whatever those feelings were, and the record does not allow anyone to say with confidence what Emma Coronel felt about Joaquin Guzman at any point in their marriage. The function of her public presence was organizational as much as personal. She was, whether she fully understood it or not, performing a role that served the cartel's interests in managing its most significant legal crisis in decades. The performance required specific things of her. It required that she appear calm when the natural response to her situation might have been something else entirely. It required that she communicate loyalty without communicating complicity, that she stand close enough to Guzman to demonstrate devotion, but not so close that she invited scrutiny of her own role in his operations. It required that she say very little. Emma's public statements during this period were minimal, carefully worded, and notable mostly for what they avoided. She expressed love for her husband. She expressed confidence in his legal team. She did not discuss the cartel. She did not discuss the tunnel at Altiplano. She did not discuss the years in safe houses or the properties maintained by the organization or the operational realities of her marriage. She had been speaking the language of necessary silence since childhood. It came naturally. In July 2017, 6 months after Guzman had been extradited to the United States and was being held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, Emma gave an interview to Telemundo, her first significant media appearance in which she spoke at length. The interview was conducted by journalist Maria Celeste Herreras, and it covered the expected territory: Emma's life with Guzman, her feelings about his imprisonment, her hopes for his legal situation. What made the interview notable was not what Emma revealed, but how she revealed nothing while appearing to reveal a great deal. She spoke warmly of Guzman. She described him as a good father, as a man who was loving with the twins. She described her own situation, managing the children largely alone, living in a kind of suspended uncertainty, with a composure that the interviewer noted explicitly. She cried at certain points, which the camera documented carefully. She looked, throughout, like a woman who was suffering with dignity. The interview was widely covered and generated significant sympathy in certain quarters, particularly in Mexico, where Guzman retained a complicated folk hero status in some communities. What the interview also did, less visibly, was establish a version of Emma that could be maintained going forward. A devoted wife, a present mother. A woman caught in circumstances beyond her control. This version asked the audience to see Emma as a peripheral figure in Guzman's story, rather than a participant in it, to extend to her the sympathy owed to someone adjacent to power, rather than the scrutiny appropriate to someone who had operated within it. The interview was broadcast while federal prosecutors in New York were continuing to build their case against Guzman. The trial would not begin until November 2018, more than a year away. During that intervening period, Emma maintained the public persona that the Telemundo interview had solidified. She attended hearings at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn when permitted. She continued to dress with the same deliberate precision. She continued to say very little of substance in public. But there were things happening during this period that the public persona was designed to absorb and redirect. Court filings and prosecutorial documents were accumulating details about the organizational structure of the Sinaloa cartel and the people within it. Emma's name appeared in these documents, not prominently, not as a central figure, but as a presence, a name attached to certain communications, certain properties, certain movements of money. These appearances in the documentary record were quiet and easy to miss in the volume of material being generated by one of the largest federal drug trafficking prosecutions in American history. The carefully composed woman attending hearings in coordinated outfits was also, according to this accumulating record, a woman whose name kept appearing in places that the composed public image was carefully designed to make seem implausible. The construction of a public face is always, in some sense, a negotiation between what is true and what is useful. Emma's image during these years served multiple purposes simultaneously. It served Guzman's legal strategy, it served the cartel's interest in managing the narrative around its leadership, and it served Emma herself in establishing a version of her identity that kept the most dangerous questions at a distance. She was the wife, she was the mother, she was the woman in the gallery. What she was not, in this version, was an agent, a person who made decisions, took actions, accepted responsibilities. The public face she had been given, or had accepted, or had constructed in collaboration with people whose interests aligned with this particular image, was the face of someone to whom things happened, rather than someone who made things happen. The record would eventually suggest otherwise. During the period between Guzman's extradition in January 2017 and the beginning of his trial in November 2018, Emma was also navigating the practical realities of her life in a way that received almost no public attention. She was living in the United States, primarily in the Los Angeles area, managing the twins who were now 6 and 7 years old, and attending school. Her immigration status during this period has never been fully clarified in public reporting. Her financial situation, how she was funding her life in California, covering legal fees, managing the costs associated with being the wife of a man facing federal prosecution, was similarly opaque. These practical questions matter because they point toward a reality that the composed courthouse appearances obscured. Emma's life during this period was not simply one of patient, dignified waiting. It was a life of active management, of navigating immigration bureaucracies, of maintaining relationships with a legal team working on a case of extraordinary complexity, of managing the expectations of an organizational structure that still existed and still had interests to protect, even with its leader in federal custody. She was not passive. She could not afford to be. But the image she projected, the one that circulated in the photographs from the courthouse steps and the clips from the Telemundo interview, was precisely that: patient, dignified, waiting. A woman who had given her life to a man and was now enduring the consequence of that with grace. It was a performance that required considerable effort to maintain, and it was, during these years, working. Lancaster, California is a high desert city in the Antelope Valley, about 70 miles north of Los Angeles. It is not a place associated with cartel royalty or federal fugitives or the operational logistics of transnational drug trafficking. It has a military base nearby, a modest downtown, neighborhoods of single-family homes stretched across flat terrain, under a sky that is almost always bright and almost always vast. It is, in almost every visible sense, an ordinary American city. It was here at Antelope Valley Hospital that Emma Coronel gave birth to twin daughters on August 15, 2011. She was 21 years old. Guzman was not present. His fugitive status made travel to California impossible without extraordinary risk, and the birth of his children was not, within the operational logic of his existence, sufficient reason to expose his location. Emma labored and delivered without him, in a hospital in a desert city, surrounded by people whose names have never appeared in any public record of this event. The twins were named Emma Joaquina and Maria Joaquina, both first names drawn from their parents, Emma from their mother, Joaquina from their father, rendered in the feminine. The doubling of the father's name across both daughters in a culture where naming carries the weight of lineage and loyalty was a gesture that communicated something specific about how these children were being situated within the family's identity. They were El Chapo's daughters. That was the primary thing. The choice to deliver in California had been planned carefully. Emma had entered the United States on documents that allowed her legal presence, and the birth itself was straightforward in a medical sense. What it produced, beyond two healthy children, was two American birth certificates, two Social Security numbers, two sets of legal rights attached to the most stable and legally protected citizenship in the world. In the context of Emma's actual life, a life built on the operational infrastructure of a fugitive cartel leader, this was not a sentimental decision about wanting her daughters to have opportunities. It was a hedge. It was the construction of an exit that did not yet have a destination. The twins grew up inside the same nomadic, controlled existence that had defined Emma's life since her marriage. They moved between properties. They did not attend school in any consistent, traceable way during the early years. The people around them were cartel associates and their families, not the ordinary social world of Mexican childhood. They were, by all available evidence, loved. Emma's public statements about her daughters are among the few moments where her composure shifts into something that reads as unguarded. But love inside the cartel's operational requirements still meant growing up in a world organized around concealment, around movement, around the ever-present reality that the man whose name they carried twice was the most wanted person in Mexico. After Guzman's first arrest in February 2014, Emma's situation with the twins changed in ways that were not immediately visible publicly, but were practically significant. The security infrastructure that had surrounded her daily life, the guards, the maintained properties, the organizational support that came with being El Chapo's wife, did not disappear overnight with his arrest. The Sinaloa cartel continued to function. Its leadership structures, while disrupted, remained operational. Emma and the twins continued to receive the practical support of an organization that still had resources and still had reasons to protect the family of its imprisoned leader. But the nature of that protection had shifted. Before the arrest, Emma's safety was part of the operational logic of keeping Guzman functional. A happy, stable domestic situation was part of maintaining the man who ran the organization. After the arrest, her safety became something closer to an organizational obligation, a loyalty maintained partly out of genuine cartel culture around family, and partly because Emma's cooperation with or against the organization had significant implications for what she might say to prosecutors who were, even in 2014, beginning to circle. Guzman escaped from Altiplano in July 2015. The tunnel, a mile long, ventilated, lit, equipped with a modified motorcycle on rails, had taken months to construct and required coordination, funding, and information about the prison's layout that could only have come from inside. The planning for the escape began, according to prosecutors' later accounting, not long after his incarceration, and Emma's name appeared in the eventual reconstruction of the escape's planning, not as an architect, but as a conduit. someone through whom communications had been relayed between Guzman inside the prison and the organizational structures outside working to free him. The specific nature of Emma's involvement in the Altiplano escape became a formal prosecutorial allegation only years later, when she was charged in 2021. But the shape of what prosecutors would allege was already visible in the documentary record accumulating around Guzman's legal proceedings. During the months between his first arrest and his escape, Emma visited him in Altiplano. The visits were subject to monitoring. What was communicated during those visits, in conversation, in gesture, in whatever passed between them in a supervised setting, was subject to the limits of what monitoring could capture. The escape happened. Guzman was free for 6 months, and during those 6 months, Emma's daily existence became something that has never been publicly described in detail. Guzman was back in Mexico moving through the Sierra Madre, but now with the additional pressure of a Mexican government that had been internationally humiliated by his escape and was under extraordinary pressure to recapture him. The 6 months of his freedom after Altiplano were the most operationally pressured of his life, and Emma's proximity to him during any part of that period carried risks that dwarfed what she had experienced before. He was recaptured in January 2016, extradited to the United States in January 2017. And now Emma was in a genuinely new situation. Her husband was in American federal custody facing prosecution in a jurisdiction with a conviction rate above 95% and sentencing guidelines that would mean, if convicted, the rest of his life in a maximum security facility. The Mexican legal system, with all its documented susceptibility to cartel influence, was no longer the arena. American federal court was. The twins were 5 years old when their father was extradited. They were American citizens living in California. Emma was managing their daily lives while simultaneously managing the demands of supporting a husband facing federal trial, maintaining relationships with a legal team, and navigating the increasing attention of federal investigators who were building a case that, even at this stage, included references to her own potential exposure. There is a specific moment from this period that surfaces in later court documents and journalistic accounts, though it received relatively little attention at the time. Emma, in the period following Guzman's extradition, made contact with individuals involved in producing a television series based on El Chapo's life, a project that would eventually become the Netflix series of that name. The nature of Emma's involvement in these discussions, what she sought to control or influence about how her husband's story would be told, and what she received in exchange for any cooperation she may have offered, has never been fully established in the public record. What the episode illustrates is something that the composed courthouse appearances obscured. Emma was not simply enduring her situation. She was actively working within it, making contact with media and entertainment interests, trying to shape the narrative around Guzman in ways that served purposes she was managing on her own. This was not a passive woman waiting for circumstances to resolve. It was someone exercising what agency she had within a situation that constrained her severely. But the nature of that agency, who it ultimately served, whose interests it advanced, is where the picture becomes complicated. Every action Emma took during this period existed inside a web of obligations and pressures that had been accumulating since her wedding in Canelas in 2007. The organization expected loyalty. The legal team expected a client's family to behave in ways that supported the defense. The cartel's remaining leadership, still operational despite Guzman's imprisonment, had interests in how the trial unfolded. And Emma's own freedom, her ability to continue living in California with her daughters, to avoid becoming a prosecution target herself, required that she navigate all of these competing pressures simultaneously. The twins were growing. They were in school. They were, by Emma's accounts, adjusting as well as children could to a situation that had no ordinary template. Their father was on trial in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn. Their mother attended when she could, dressed in the careful way that had become her public signature. They had American names on American birth certificates in a country that was prosecuting their father. Emma had planned for this, had chosen this hospital in this desert city precisely because she understood that the world she was living in had a foreseeable shape. She had thought far enough ahead, at 21, to secure something stable for her daughters in a world built entirely on instability. What she had not been able to plan for, or had planned for and proceeded anyway, was what the trial itself would reveal. Not about Guzman, whose guilt was, in the most technical sense, never seriously in doubt, but about the people around him, about the infrastructure of his life, about the woman who had been present throughout. Traveling between safe houses, giving birth in California, relaying communications in a federal prison, appearing at hearings in coordinated outfits while prosecutors built a file with her name in it. The twins had their father's name, they had their mother's presence, and they were growing up in the one country in the world best positioned to prosecute everyone around them. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn, New York, sits at the edge of Cadman Plaza, a civic space of trees and benches that feels deliberately calm, given the weight of what happens inside the building. On November 13, 2018, jury selection began in the United States versus Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera. The case had taken years to build, involved prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions, and rested on a body of evidence: wiretaps, financial records, seized communications, and most significantly, the testimony of former cartel associates who had agreed to cooperate with the government. That was, by any measure, extraordinary in its scope. Emma Coronel attended. She was there for the opening, and she returned throughout the trial's duration, which stretched across nearly 3 months. She sat in the gallery behind the defense table, in view of her husband and in view of the jury. She dressed, as she had dressed for every public appearance since 2016, with a precision that read as deliberate under any scrutiny. The outfits changed, different colors, different silhouettes, but the register was consistent. She looked composed. She looked present. She looked like a woman who had decided that her primary function in that courtroom was to be visible in a specific way. The jury noticed. Several jurors, speaking to journalists after the verdict, mentioned Emma unprompted. They described her clothing choices, the way she carried herself, the fact that she seemed, in their words, almost out of place, too put together, too composed for the setting. One juror described her as looking like she was attending a fashion event rather than a federal drug trial. This observation was not offered as a compliment. It registered as something slightly off, something that did not quite resolve into a coherent human response to the situation. What was happening inside the courtroom during those 3 months was, for Emma, something considerably more significant than a fashion observation. The prosecution called more than 50 witnesses. Many of them were former cartel associates, men who had worked directly with Guzman, who had managed operations, moved shipments, handled violence, and then, at some point, been arrested and made the calculation that cooperation with American federal prosecutors was preferable to the alternative. These men took the stand and described in procedural detail the operational world of the Sinaloa cartel. And in describing that world, they described Emma, not centrally, not as a focus, but she appeared in the testimony with a consistency that was difficult to dismiss as incidental. Witnesses described her presence at cartel properties. They described communications that passed through her. One witness described a period following Guzman's 2014 arrest in which Emma had been involved in relaying messages between Guzman and Altiplano prison and the organizational structures working to arrange his escape. The testimony was specific about the mechanism, that Emma had used visits to Guzman to carry information in and out of the prison, that she had served as a communication channel during a period when the organization was actively planning to break its leader out of a federal facility. Emma sat in the gallery while this testimony was delivered. Her expression, according to journalists covering the trial who watched her carefully during these moments, did not visibly change. The composure held. Whatever was happening internally, the experience of hearing yourself described in federal court testimony as a participant in an escape from a maximum security prison, did not surface on her face in any way that the gallery could read. This composure, maintained across months of testimony that touched on her role with increasing directness, was itself a kind of statement. It communicated that she had prepared for this, that she had known this testimony was coming, that nothing being said in that courtroom was a surprise to her, which meant she had either been briefed by the legal team extensively enough to have processed it in advance, or she had been present for enough of what was being described that the testimony was simply a formal account of things she already knew. The most significant witness testimony as it related to Emma came from individuals who had been directly involved in Guzman's day-to-day operations. One witness described the network of encrypted communications, a custom system using modified BlackBerry devices that Guzman had used to run the cartel from hiding. The system had been set up, maintained, and monitored by IT specialists working for the organization. Communications through this system were extensive, covering everything from shipment logistics to organizational violence to personal matters. Emma's name appeared in these communications. The nature of her appearance was not simply as a recipient of personal messages from her husband. It was as someone whose name was associated with specific operational matters. The encrypted communications evidence was among the most technically detailed aspects of the prosecution's case, and much of it was presented in ways that were difficult for non-specialists to follow in real time. But the underlying picture it assembled, across days of testimony and document presentation, was of an organization in which the boundaries between personal life and operational life were not maintained in any consistent way. People who were family members, domestic partners, spouses. They were not insulated from the organization's communications and activities by their personal relationships. They were, in various degrees, part of the operational fabric. Emma occupied this space, the intersection of personal and operational, in ways that the prosecution was documenting carefully. The trial was about Guzman, and the prosecution's primary goal was his conviction on the charges before the court. Emma was context. She was part of the picture being assembled. But the picture being assembled had implications that extended beyond Guzman, and those implications were not lost on anyone in the courtroom with a legal background. Outside the courthouse, the coverage of the trial was extensive and global. The testimony produced daily headlines, accounts of extraordinary violence, of bribes paid to government officials at the highest levels, of a drug trafficking operation that had moved hundreds of tons of cocaine and other substances into the United States over decades. Emma's presence in the gallery was a consistent element of the coverage, her outfits cataloged and discussed with a specificity that occasionally veered into something uncomfortable. The reduction of a woman at a federal drug trial to a fashion subject, the way her appearance became a story that displaced the more difficult story of what her presence in that courtroom actually meant. Some of the coverage was sympathetic, framing Emma as a young woman who had been swept up in a world she had not chosen. This version had enough truth in it to be persuasive. She had been a teenager when she married. She had been raised inside a world organized around the cartel. The conditions of her adult life had been severely constrained, but it required significant omissions to sustain itself. It required setting aside the testimony about the prison communications. It required ignoring the accumulated documentary evidence that placed her with some consistency in proximity not just to Guzman personally, but to specific operational decisions. The trial lasted until February 2019. On February 12th, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 10 counts. Guzman was convicted of engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to launder narcotics proceeds, and multiple drug trafficking charges. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone who had followed the proceedings. The evidence had been overwhelming by any standard. Emma was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She watched her husband receive the judgment that would eventually result in a sentence of life in prison plus 30 years. The composure held. She did not cry visibly. She did not react in any way that the gallery could describe as dramatic. Afterward, she made a brief statement outside the courthouse, expressing in careful language that she stood by her husband, that she believed the legal process had been unfair, that she intended to continue supporting his legal efforts. The statement was, like everything Emma had said publicly since 2016, composed, measured, and carefully bounded. It said what it needed to say, and nothing more. But the trial had done something that no public statement could undo. It had assembled, in the formal record of a federal court proceeding, a picture of Emma Coronel that was substantially different from the one she had been constructing through her courthouse appearances and her Telemundo interview. The picture in the court record was of a woman who had been present, who had communicated, who had relayed information, who had appeared in the documentation of a criminal enterprise's operations with a regularity that was not consistent with the role of a purely domestic, uninvolved spouse. That picture was now part of the public record. It was accessible to prosecutors, it was accessible to journalists, and it was accessible to the federal investigators who were, even as the jury delivered its verdict against Guzman, continuing to look at the people around him. Emma left the courthouse that February afternoon. She had her daughters to return to. She had, by the visible evidence of her demeanor, decided how to carry what had just happened. The same way she had been carrying everything for years, quietly, carefully, with a face that did not give anything away. The investigators continued their work. There is a specific kind of organizational loyalty that looks from the outside like devotion. It maintains the language of family, of commitment, of standing by someone through difficulty. It performs these things genuinely enough that the performance and the reality become difficult to separate, even for the person performing them. What distinguishes it from ordinary devotion is that it operates within a structure that has interests of its own, interests that may align with personal loyalty in good times and diverge from it under pressure. Emma Coronel's actions in the years surrounding Guzman's trial and conviction cannot be understood cleanly as either personal loyalty or calculated organizational behavior. They were, most likely, both simultaneously. That simultaneity is what makes them worth examining carefully. The Sinaloa cartel didn't cease to function when Guzman was extradited to the United States in January 2017. This is a point that tends to get lost in the narrative gravity of a single leader's legal proceedings. The organization he had built across decades was not a personality cult that collapsed without him, though it was disrupted. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with diversified operations, distributed leadership, and institutional knowledge that existed independently of any single figure. The men who had run specific aspects of its operations, logistics, enforcement, financial management, political relationships, continued to operate. The product continued to move. The money continued to flow. What changed was the question of succession and the management of the transition. Guzman's sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo, and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, were asserting themselves within the organizational hierarchy during this period, consolidating authority, managing relationships with other cartel factions, and doing so in ways that were sometimes violent and always politically complex within the organization's internal culture. Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, who had been Guzman's longtime partner in leading Sinaloa, was also navigating this transition, managing his own position relative to the Guzman sons and the broader organizational realignment. Emma occupied a specific and delicate position within this landscape. As Guzman's wife, she carried a legitimacy within the organization that was real and potentially useful. She was the mother of his youngest children. She had access to him, limited, monitored access, but access through the federal prison visitation system. In an organization where communication with imprisoned leadership was a significant operational challenge, a family member with visitation rights was a resource. The prosecution's eventual charging documents against Emma, filed in February 2021, alleged that she had used this position actively. The charges described a conspiracy to distribute cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana in the United States. Specific federal drug trafficking charges rather than a general conspiracy allegation. The indictment alleged that Emma had participated in planning Guzman's escape from federal prison, that she had communicated with cartel members about operational matters, and that she had engaged in drug trafficking activities herself. These were serious allegations, and their specificity mattered. The government was not claiming that Emma had been a passive bystander who had happened to be married to a cartel leader. It was claiming that she had functioned as an active participant in specific criminal activities, including activities that post-dated her husband's incarceration. Activities she would have had to choose to engage in, given that the organizational infrastructure she had been embedded in since childhood was no longer the only context shaping her decisions. By the time of the alleged conduct, Emma was an adult in her early 30s, living in the United States with access to legal counsel and, through her daughter's citizenship, to legitimate pathways in American society. The gap between that reality and the choices the indictment alleged she had made is the most psychologically significant element of her story, and it is also the least clearly documented. What the charging documents describe are actions. What they cannot describe, what no legal document can, is the interior experience of someone who had been raised inside a particular world and was now navigating it from a position that had changed dramatically without the world itself having changed. Consider what Emma's situation actually looked like in the period between Guzman's extradition in 2017 and her arrest in February 2021. She was living in California with twin daughters who were by then between 6 and 10 years old. She had no publicly documented source of income. Her husband was facing federal prosecution and then serving a life sentence. The legal fees associated with his defense had been extraordinary. Estimates varied, but the cost of mounting a defense in a case of that complexity ran into millions of dollars. Someone was funding that defense. The question of where that money came from and what Emma's role was in managing it was one that federal investigators were examining. The cartel's financial infrastructure was simultaneously one of its most sophisticated and most legally vulnerable aspects. The organization had, over decades, developed elaborate systems for moving drug proceeds through shell companies, through real estate, through cash businesses, through a network of money brokers and financial intermediaries that spanned multiple countries. Emma's name had appeared in some of this infrastructure, not prominently but consistently enough that investigators had reason to follow the threads. What prosecutors eventually alleged was that Emma had not simply been the recipient of cartel funds, a passive beneficiary of her husband's organization, but had been an active participant in moving money and coordinating logistics in ways that constituted criminal conduct. The distinction matters legally and it matters narratively. A wife who lives on money provided by her cartel husband is in a morally complex but legally distinct position from a wife who actively manages the movement of that money and participates in the planning of criminal activities. The indictment placed Emma in the second category. There were people around Emma during this period whose interests aligned with her continuing to operate within the organizational structure. Los Chapitos had reasons to maintain the loyalty of their father's wife, both as a matter of cartel culture around family and as a practical matter of managing the organizational communications that her access to Guzman facilitated. The legal team managing Guzman's appeals had reasons to keep Emma cooperative and stable. The cartel's financial infrastructure had interests in maintaining relationships with people who could serve as conduits for organizational resources. All of these interests converged on Emma in ways that made it difficult, perhaps impossible, to locate a clean moment of personal choice where she decided to become criminally complicit rather than simply continuing to exist within a world that had always operated this way. The gradations between being embedded in a criminal organization and actively participating in it are real, but they are not always clearly marked from the inside. Emma had been inside this world since she was a child. The activities she was alleged to have participated in were, within the logic of that world, not extraordinary departures from what was expected of her. They were continuations. But continuation is itself a choice, even when it does not feel like one. There's a specific detail from this period that appears in journalistic reconstructions and which illuminates the texture of Emma's situation in a way that charging documents cannot. Emma had been, since the trial at minimum, in contact with various media and entertainment interests seeking access to the Guzman story. The Netflix series had aired. Other productions were in development. The commercial value of proximity to El Chapo's story, his wife's perspective, her account of the marriage, her experience of the trial, was real and was being actively sought by multiple parties. Emma appears to have engaged with some of these interests in ways that generated income. The nature of these arrangements, what she agreed to, what she received, what she disclosed, has never been fully established publicly. But the pattern of engagement suggests that Emma understood her own story as a commodity, that she was attempting to convert her proximity to Guzman's legend into something that could sustain her life in California in the absence of any other documented income source. This is not, in itself, criminal. People connected to famous or infamous figures sell their stories. What makes it complicated in Emma's case is the question of what story she was selling and what she was not selling alongside it. The public version of Emma's story, the one available through her media engagements, was the composed, loyal wife story. The version in the federal charging documents was considerably more active, considerably more implicated. The loyalty that Emma had been performing publicly since 2016 was real in some dimension. She attended the trial. She supported the appeals. She expressed in every public forum available to her devotion to a man serving life in prison. But loyalty in the world she had inhabited since childhood was never purely personal. It was also organizational. It was a currency with a specific value within a specific economy, and it needed to be maintained because its maintenance served interests beyond the personal. When that loyalty became a business model, when it was packaged and sold to media interests, when it was performed in courtrooms for strategic reasons, when it was maintained as an organizational asset, the personal feeling at its core, whatever it genuinely was, became inseparable from its function. Emma had learned since childhood how to hold these two things simultaneously: the genuine and the functional, the personal and the organizational, without appearing to experience any tension between them. The composure that jurors had noted, that journalists had documented, that observers had interpreted variously as dignity or coldness or performance, was the outward expression of this capacity. She had been trained for it by years of living inside a world where what you showed and what was true were never required to be the same thing. Federal investigators had been watching this composure for years. They had been building a case around it, constructing an evidentiary picture of what lay beneath the careful surface. By late 2020, that picture was complete enough to act on. The arrest was coming. Emma, who had navigated so much with such visible control, was running out of room. Washington Dulles International Airport sits in the Virginia countryside about 26 miles west of the capital, a building designed in the early 1960s by Eero Saarinen, with a roof that sweeps upward at both ends like something caught mid-flight. It is a place of constant movement, arrivals and departures, the bureaucratic choreography of customs and immigration, the particular anonymity of international transit where thousands of people pass through daily without anyone noting their presence. It is, in its architecture and its function, a place where things can happen quietly. On February 22, 2021, Emma Coronel Aispuro arrived at Dulles on an international flight. She was 31 years old. She was traveling, by available accounts, without the kind of security detail that had surrounded her movements for most of her adult life. The organizational infrastructure that had once made her travel a managed, protected logistical operation had, by this point, been significantly degraded by years of prosecutions, arrests, and the general attrition that comes from sustained federal law enforcement attention. She walked through the terminal. She reached the customs and immigration area, and there, in the fluorescent procedural calm of a federal inspection zone, she was arrested by agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration. The arrest was not dramatic. There was no pursuit, no resistance, no scene. The DEA agents identified themselves and Emma Coronel, who had spent years being photographed in courthouse galleries, who had given carefully managed interviews about her life, who had built a public persona of composed, controlled presence, was taken into custody in an airport corridor. The moment was witnessed by other travelers who would not have known who she was. It was documented in federal paperwork that described it in the flat procedural language that federal arrests require. The charging documents that accompanied her arrest described a conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, for importation into the United States. They also alleged her participation in planning Guzman's escape from Altiplano Federal Prison in 2015. The charges were the product of an investigation that had been running by this point for years, accumulating the evidence that the trial testimony had pointed toward, building the evidentiary case that the charging documents represented. Emma was transported to federal detention. She was processed. She was assigned an attorney. The machinery of the federal criminal justice system, the same machinery that had consumed her husband over the preceding years, now enclosed her. The timing of the arrest, February 22nd, carries a detail that did not go unnoticed in press coverage. It was exactly 7 years to the day after Guzman's first arrest in Mazatlan on February 22, 2014. Whether this was deliberate on the part of federal investigators, a piece of symbolic timing chosen for effect, or simply a coincidence produced by the completion of the evidentiary case at that moment, has never been clarified. The DEA did not comment on the date, but the symmetry was there and it was noted. What the arrest revealed most starkly was Emma's isolation. The woman taken into custody at Dulles that February afternoon did not have the organizational support around her that had characterized every previous crisis in her adult life. When Guzman was arrested in 2014, the cartel's infrastructure had closed around Emma and the twins, providing practical support and operational continuity. When Guzman was recaptured in 2016, the same infrastructure had mobilized. When he was extradited in 2017, there were lawyers, there were cartel-connected supporters, there were people whose interests aligned with managing the situation carefully. In February 2021, Emma walked into Dulles Airport without a security detail and was arrested by federal agents. The organizational world that had defined her life since childhood had, in the most concrete possible sense, failed to protect her. Whether that failure was the result of the organization's degradation under years of law enforcement pressure, or whether it reflected a more deliberate withdrawal of support from a figure who had become more of a liability than an asset, or whether Emma had simply made the error of traveling without taking adequate precautions, is not something the public record clearly establishes. What is clear is that she was alone. The twins were 10 years old. They were in California, and their mother was now in federal detention on the East Coast, facing charges that carried potential sentences of 10 years to life. The logistical reality of their situation, two American citizen children with an imprisoned father serving life and a now arrested mother facing federal charges, required immediate management of a kind that the charging documents did not address. Emma's attorney, in the days following the arrest, confirmed that the twins were being cared for by family members. Which family members, in what location, under what circumstances, was not publicly specified. The cartel world's code around protecting children of imprisoned leaders would have ensured that the girls were not left without support. But the nature of that support, who was providing it, what it cost, what it required in exchange, is opaque in the way that cartel family arrangements are always opaque to outside documentation. The initial court appearances following the arrest were procedurally straightforward. Emma appeared before a federal magistrate. She was ordered held without bail, a decision that reflected the prosecution's argument that she presented both a flight risk and a danger to the community. The flight risk designation was supported by her international travel, her connections to cartel infrastructure, and her financial resources, which the prosecution argued were sufficient to enable her to disappear if released. The danger designation rested on the nature of the alleged conduct. Participation in a drug trafficking conspiracy of significant scale. The no-bail ruling meant that Emma remained in federal detention from the moment of her arrest. The managed, controlled world she had inhabited, where she made decisions about when to appear publicly, how to dress, what to say, who to speak to, was replaced by the total institutional management of federal pretrial detention. The composure that had been her most visible public characteristic was now being maintained, if it was being maintained at all in a context where no one was watching and photographing and reporting on it. Journalists who had covered her throughout the trial period noted the absence of the usual management. There were no coordinated public statements from her legal team. There were no carefully framed photographs. There was no Telemundo interview in preparation. The apparatus that had constructed and maintained Emma's public image for 5 years had gone quiet, and in that quiet a different picture became visible. Not of a composed, loyal wife attending her husband's legal proceedings, but of a woman in federal detention, separated from her children, facing charges that would require her to make decisions that no amount of composure could defer indefinitely. The DEA's press release announcing the arrest was brief and procedural. It named Emma Coronel Aispuro, identified her as the wife of Joaquin Guzman Loera, described the charges, and noted that if convicted she faced a minimum of 10 years in federal prison. The release was issued and picked up by wire services and distributed globally within hours. Emma's name ran across news tickers and website front pages in a register entirely different from the courthouse gallery photographs. She was not the loyal wife anymore, or not only that, she was a defendant. The distance between those two designations, wife and defendant, had been narrowing for years, accumulating in court testimony and charging documents and prosecutorial filings that most of the public coverage of Emma had declined to foreground. The arrest collapsed that distance into a single bureaucratic moment in an airport corridor. There is something specific about the location of the arrest. The airport, the transit space, the place designed for movement, that sits against the reality of what it produced. Emma had spent her adult life in motion, moving between safe houses, between countries, between public appearances and private disappearances, always subject to the operational requirements of someone else's security calculus. The airport was, in a narrow sense, the last point of that mobility before it ended. She arrived in motion and left in custody. The composure, if it held, and there is no account from that corridor that says otherwise, held for no audience in particular. The other travelers continued through customs. The DEA agents completed their paperwork. The fluorescent lights were indifferent to what had just happened. Outside the terminal, the world continued with the ordinary indifference it extends to all arrests, however significant. In California, two 10-year-old girls with American birth certificates and their father's name were waking up to a day that would change their lives in ways they were too young to fully understand and old enough to feel entirely. Emma Coronel had been trying, since they were born, to build something stable for them. The airport at Dulles on a February morning was where that effort ran into the limit of what careful planning and composed public appearances and organizational loyalty could actually protect against. The federal detention facility where Emma Coronel was held following her arrest at Dulles is not a place designed for extended contemplation. It is a place designed for containment, the management of people who are legally presumed innocent but practically confined, suspended between the life they had and the legal proceeding that will determine what comes next. The days inside such a facility have a specific texture: institutional meal, limited movement, access to legal counsel and supervised settings, the slow accumulation of hours that are neither free nor formally punished. Emma spent approximately 4 months in this suspension before the trajectory of her case became clear. On June 10, 2021, Emma Coronel Ispuro appeared in federal court in Washington, D.C., and entered a guilty plea to 3 charges: conspiracy to distribute cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana for importation into the United States, conspiracy to launder drug proceeds, and a charge related to engaging in transactions with a specially designated narcotics trafficker. The plea was the product of negotiations between her attorneys and federal prosecutors that had been ongoing since her arrest. The terms of those negotiations, what Emma agreed to provide, what the government agreed to recommend in return, were partially visible in the court record and partially not. The plea agreement required Emma to cooperate with federal investigators. This was standard in cases of this kind. Cooperation agreements are the primary mechanism through which the federal government extracts useful information from defendants with knowledge of criminal organizations, and the potential sentencing benefits of cooperation are significant enough that defendants with relevant knowledge are strongly incentivized to provide it. Emma had relevant knowledge. She had been inside the organizational world of the Sinaloa cartel since childhood. She had been present for events, conversations, and decisions that federal investigators had been working to document for years. What she actually told federal investigators under the terms of her cooperation agreement has never been publicly disclosed in full. Cooperation agreements typically include provisions about what the defendant will testify to if called, what information they will provide about organizational structure and operations, and what crimes they will admit to beyond those covered by the formal charges. The specific contents of Emma's cooperation, which individuals she identified, which operational details she described, which previously unknown information she provided, remain sealed within the federal investigative record. This silence is itself significant. The prosecution of cartel figures in American federal court has over decades generated a consistent pattern. Lower-level or peripheral defendants cooperate, provide information about higher-level figures, and that information feeds subsequent prosecutions. The testimony that had damaged Guzman so thoroughly at his 2018 to 2019 trial had come in large part from exactly this mechanism. Former associates who had cooperated with the government and provided detailed accounts of organizational operations in exchange for sentencing consideration. Emma's cooperation placed her within this mechanism. Whatever she told investigators about the operations she had witnessed, the communications she had relayed, the financial arrangements she had participated in, the people she had known and observed across 15 years inside the cartel's orbit, was now part of the federal government's accumulating knowledge about the organization. The full implications of what she disclosed will only become visible, if they become visible at all, through future prosecutions in which her information surfaces as evidence. What the guilty plea said explicitly was carefully bounded. Emma admitted to the charges as filed. She acknowledged in the formal language of a federal plea allocution that she had participated in drug trafficking conspiracy and money laundering. The admissions were specific to the charges and did not require her to elaborate beyond their technical requirements. The courtroom colloquy between Emma, her attorney, and the judge was procedural, moving through the required elements of a valid guilty plea. The voluntariness of the decision, the understanding of the charges and their consequences, the factual basis for each count, without generating the kind of narrative that would illuminate what the experience of standing in that courtroom actually meant to her. She said what she needed to say. She did not say more. The silences within the plea allocution are as informative as its contents. Emma did not describe the arc of her life, the childhood in Durango, the festival in 2007, the wedding 3 days after her 18th birthday. She did not describe what it had been like to be married to Joaquin Guzman, to follow his security requirements across years of displacement, to give birth to her daughters alone in a California hospital, to attend his trial in coordinated outfits, while testimony described her participation in his escape from federal prison. None of this was required by the plea, and none of it was offered. The allocution confirmed legal facts. It left everything else intact, sealed inside whatever Emma Coronel had accumulated over 31 years of living inside a world that did not require her to speak about it honestly in any public setting. Her sentencing was scheduled for November 2021 but was delayed multiple times, a pattern consistent with ongoing cooperation. Courts typically delay sentencing for cooperating defendants until investigators have had the opportunity to use the defendant's information in ongoing proceedings. The delay suggested that Emma's cooperation was active and that the government considered it valuable enough to protect through the sentencing process. During this period, Emma remained in federal detention. She had been held since her February arrest, and the delays in sentencing extended her pretrial detention considerably beyond what the initial timeline would have suggested. The twins, now 10 and then 11 years old, were in California with family members whose identities remained publicly unspecified. Emma's access to them during this period was limited to supervised calls and, eventually, supervised visits, the managed, monitored contact that the federal detention system permits between defendants and their families. The contrast between the twins' situation and the circumstances of their birth is stark in a way that the record presents without commentary. Emma had traveled to Lancaster in 2011 specifically to give them American citizenship, to secure them legal protections and future possibilities that she understood, at 21, they would need. A decade later, those daughters were American citizens whose mother was in federal detention and whose father was serving life in a maximum security facility. The American citizenship Emma had worked to secure was now the primary legal framework protecting them from a more precarious situation. The hedge had paid off in a specific, narrow sense. The broader calculation that securing their legal status would be sufficient protection against what actually happened had not. The sentencing that eventually occurred in November 2021, though continued proceedings pushed the final resolution further, involved the judge reviewing the terms of the plea agreement, the prosecution's recommendations regarding Emma's cooperation, and the defense's arguments for sentencing consideration. The cooperation agreement gave the prosecution the ability to recommend a sentence below the guidelines minimum if they considered the cooperation substantial. Whether they made such a recommendation and on what basis was reflected in the court proceedings without generating extensive public documentation of the underlying evaluation. Emma was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, a sentence that, given the charges and their potential minimums, reflected significant credit for cooperation. The sentence was imposed and Emma began serving it, moving from pretrial detention into the formal category of federal prisoner. The infrastructure of her life, whatever remained of it, reconfigured around this new reality. The cooperation agreement and the sentence it produced illuminate something about the position Emma had occupied within the cartel's organizational structure. The government does not offer substantial sentencing reductions for cooperation unless the defendant has information of genuine investigative value. The reduction Emma received suggests that she did have such information, that her years inside the cartel's operational world had given her knowledge that federal investigators considered useful. This means that whatever her public image had suggested about her peripheral domestic role, the government's actual assessment was that she had been close enough to the organization's operations to know things worth knowing. She had known those things all along: the composed courthouse appearances, the Telemundo interview, the careful calibration of how much to say and in what register. All of it had been a management of what she knew and what she would allow to be visible. The cooperation agreement was, in one sense, the end of that management. She was now telling federal investigators things she had spent years carefully not telling anyone. What she chose to tell and what she chose to protect, even within the cooperation framework, is something only Emma and the federal investigators know. Cooperation agreements require truth, but they do not require volunteering everything. They require answering questions honestly, but a skilled attorney manages which questions are asked. The silences within the cooperation, the things not pursued, the areas not probed, are as shaped by legal strategy as the disclosures. Emma had learned to manage information since childhood. She had been doing it in cartel safe houses and federal courtrooms and Telemundo interview chairs for years. She was doing it now in the formal context of a federal cooperation agreement, with the same careful management of what surfaces and what remains below the surface that had characterized everything she had said and not said throughout her adult life. The daughters were in California. Their mother was in federal prison. Their father would never leave his maximum security cell. The American citizenship that had been their mother's most forward-looking act of planning was now their most significant practical protection. Emma had cooperated. She had pleaded guilty. She had served her time in the institutional fluorescence of the federal system, in the same general apparatus that had consumed Guzman, and that now, in a different register, had consumed her. What she had preserved through all of it, the specific contents of what she knew and had not disclosed, the interior account of what her life had actually been, remained, as it had always remained, entirely her own. Emma Coronel was released from federal prison in 2023, having served the bulk of her 3-year sentence, with credit for time already spent in pretrial detention. The release was not a public event. There was no press conference, no statement, no photograph circulated through the wire services. The woman who had been documented with such consistency throughout the years of Guzman's trial, her outfits cataloged, her composure analyzed, her courthouse appearances logged by journalists stationed outside the Brooklyn Federal Building, left federal custody without generating any image that entered the public record. She was 33 years old. The world she returned to was not the world she had left. This is true in the ordinary sense that any person emerging from incarceration finds the external landscape shifted. Technology changed, relationships reconfigured, the small rhythms of daily life requiring relearning. But for Emma, the shift was more structural than that. The organizational world that had defined her existence since childhood had, in the years of her imprisonment, continued to fracture under sustained law enforcement pressure in ways that made its previous form largely unrecoverable. The Sinaloa cartel had been experiencing a period of acute internal conflict. The faction led by Los Chapitos, Guzman's sons, and the faction aligned with Ismael Zambada Garcia, El Mayo, had been moving toward open conflict for years, a tension that reflected the generational and organizational pressures of a leadership transition that had never been cleanly resolved after Guzman's imprisonment. In July 2024, El Mayo was arrested in El Paso, Texas, in circumstances that suggested he had been lured to the United States, a development that pointed toward active betrayal within the cartel's own leadership structure. The arrest was followed by open warfare between cartel factions in Sinaloa, violence that displaced tens of thousands of civilians, and demonstrated, with unusual clarity, the human cost of the organizational conflict that had been building for years. Emma's name did not appear prominently in the coverage of this period. She was no longer a figure whose position within the organizational landscape was clear or documented. The name she carried, Coronel, still had meaning within the cartel world, but meaning of a complicated kind. Her father, Inez Coronel Barreras, had himself been arrested in 2013 and subsequently convicted of drug trafficking charges. Her uncle Nacho Coronel had been killed by the military in 2010. The family structure within which her name had carried organizational weight had been significantly diminished by the same law enforcement pressure that had consumed Guzman. The twins were 13 when Emma was released. They had spent 3 years with their mother in federal prison and their father in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility in Colorado where Guzman was transferred following his conviction, a facility specifically designed to prevent the kind of external communications and organizational influence that his presence in any less restrictive environment would have generated. The twins had American citizenship, family members in California and Mexico, and the inheritance of a name that carried extraordinary weight and almost no practical protection. What their daily lives looked like, what school they attended, what they understood about their parents' situations, what they had been told and not told about the world their family had built and the world that had dismantled it, is not documented in any public record. They are minors, and the people responsible for their care have, with apparent deliberateness, kept them outside the public record. This is, in the circumstances, the most protective thing that could be done for them. It is also, in a different sense, a continuation of the family's long practice of managing what is visible and what is not. Emma's own situation following release, on where she lives, how she funds her life, what legal conditions attach to her release, what her relationship to the cartel's remaining structures looks like, is similarly opaque. The cooperation agreement that reduced her sentence carries, in standard federal practice, ongoing obligations. A cooperating defendant is typically required to remain available to testify in related proceedings, to continue providing truthful information when asked, to refrain from further criminal conduct. These obligations do not end with release from custody. They extend into the supervised release period that follows incarceration, and they carry consequences if violated. This means that Emma's post-prison life exists within a legal framework that is simultaneously American and ongoing. She is not simply free. She is free within a structure of federal supervision that reflects her cooperation and her conviction simultaneously. A condition that has no clean parallel in the cartel world where she was raised, where loyalty was total and surveillance was the enemy rather than the governing framework. The composure that had been so extensively documented in courtroom photographs, in the Telemundo interview, in the accounts of observers who found it variously admirable, unsettling, or unreadable, had been forged in a world that required it. Whether it survives in the ordinary conditions of a post-prison life without the organizational pressure and the public staging that had always surrounded it is something no journalist or documentarian has had the access to observe. Guzman remains in ADX Florence. His appeals have been pursued and, to date, have not succeeded in altering his sentence or conditions of confinement. The facility is designed to prevent meaningful contact with the outside world. Communications are restricted, monitored, and managed in ways that make the kind of organizational influence he once exercised functionally impossible. The man who had bent an entire region of Mexico around his survival, who had built an escape tunnel beneath a federal prison, who had moved hundreds of tons of narcotics across an international border for 3 decades, now lives in a cell in the Colorado high desert from which he will not emerge. Emma's connection to him, the connection that had organized her entire adult life, that had provided the framework within which every decision she had made since she was 17 was situated, is now mediated entirely by the federal prison system. If she visits, it is in a monitored setting. If she writes, the letters are read. If she calls, the calls are recorded. The proximity to power that had been the defining condition of her existence has resolved into the most heavily managed, most surveilled version of proximity that the American carceral system can construct. The corridos about El Chapo are still played in the Sierra Madre. The legend of his escapes, his defiance of both the Mexican and American governments, his decades of evasion, has not diminished in the folk culture of the region where Emma was born. New songs are still written. The mythology is generational and does not require his freedom to sustain itself. In the communities where Emma grew up, his name still carries the specific weight of a man who, for a long time, seemed beyond the reach of any consequence. Emma's name does not appear in those songs. It never did. The corrido tradition celebrated the man, his cunning, his power, his violence rendered as vitality, and had no formal place for the woman who had lived inside the reality of what that power actually felt like from the domestic interior. She was background in the legend as she had been background in the trial testimony, as she had been background in the organizational histories that documented the cartel's operations across decades. The biography of Joaquin Guzman that will eventually settle into historical record will include Emma as a footnote, the young wife from Durango, the mother of the twins born in California, the woman who attended the trial in coordinated outfits and was later arrested at Dulles and pleaded guilty and cooperated with federal investigators and served 3 years and was released. The facts will be there. The person will not be, not really. The interior account, what it was to be 17 at that festival in 2007, what it was to follow a fugitive's security requirements across years of displacement, what it was to watch testimony describe your own actions in a federal courtroom while maintaining a face that gave nothing away, will remain undocumented in any form that history can access. The twins carry his name twice. They are American. They are growing up in a country that imprisoned both of their parents, a country that their mother had chosen for them at 21 as the safest available ground. Whether it has been safe in the ways that matter most is a question their lives will answer in time. Emma Coronel is 34 years old. She has been a cartel daughter, a narco wife, a federal defendant, a cooperating witness, a federal prisoner, and a released convict. The categories accumulate, and none of them fully describes her. She was shaped by forces she did not choose before she was old enough to choose anything, and then made choices within those forces whose full nature and extent she has never publicly described. The festival in Durango where she was crowned at 17 still happens every year. The coffee harvest comes, the guava trees fruit, and there is music and celebration in the Sierra Madre. Whether anyone there remembers the girl in the white dress on the wooden stage and what the man watching her from the crowd would eventually set in motion is not something the record can speak to. The mountains are still there. The world they enclosed is still operating in degraded and fractured form. And somewhere in it, or at the edge of it, Emma Coronel is managing the remainder of what her life has become, quietly, carefully, in the way she has always managed everything, with a face that does not give anything away. There is no clean ending to a life still being lived. Emma Coronel is in her mid-30s. Her daughters are teenagers. Her husband will die in a concrete cell in Colorado. The cartel that organized her childhood is killing people in Sinaloa as this is written. None of this has resolved into meaning. It is simply what happened and what is still happening and what will continue in forms that no one has yet documented. What the record of her life makes visible is something that the record was never designed to capture. Federal charging documents describe conduct. Trial testimony describes events. Sentencing guidelines calculate culpability in numerical terms. None of these instruments were built to answer the question of what it costs a person to live the way Emma Coronel lived. Not morally, not legally, but in the most ordinary human sense of cost. What it takes from a person to be positioned the way she was positioned, from the age she was positioned there, and to manage that positioning across decades with the kind of composure the public record consistently documents. The women in stories like this one tend to collapse into one of two available shapes. They become victims, young, naive, swept up by forces beyond their control, deserving of sympathy and absolution. Or they become accomplices, knowing, willing, as culpable as the men whose operations they supported. Both shapes are too simple. Both require discarding evidence that does not fit. Emma Coronel was raised inside a criminal organization from birth, married into its leadership at 18, and made choices as an adult that federal prosecutors considered sufficiently criminal to indict and sufficiently informed to be worth cooperating against. All of these things are simultaneously true. They do not resolve into a single shape. What is perhaps most telling about her story is what was never asked of her, publicly, legally, or otherwise. No one in any forum that produced a public record asked Emma Coronel what she wanted her life to be. Not at 17, standing on a stage in the Sierra Madre. Not at 18, 3 days after her birthday, in Canellas. Not across the years of safe houses and monitored prison visits and federal courtrooms. The question of what she wanted, separate from what was required of her, was never treated as relevant. It was not relevant to the cartel. It was not relevant to the prosecution. It was not relevant to the media coverage, which was more interested in her clothing than her interiority. She may not have known the answer herself. People raised inside total environments, where the available choices are defined and bounded by something much larger than personal preference, do not always develop a clear sense of what they would choose if the structure were removed. The structure was never removed for Emma until it collapsed around her, and by then the question of what she wanted had long since been replaced by the more immediate question of what she could survive. The twins will grow up and make their own accounts of what their childhood was. Those accounts will be shaped by what they were told and what they were not told, by what they understood and what they were protected from understanding. They will carry a name that opens certain doors in certain places and closes others everywhere else. What they do with that inheritance is not something any current record can anticipate. Somewhere in the Federal Archive, in sealed cooperation materials and monitored prison correspondence, and the accumulated documentation of years of investigation, there is a version of Emma Coronel's story that is more complete than the one available publicly. It contains the things she told federal investigators. It contains the things she chose not to tell. It contains, in the gaps between what was asked and what was answered, the shape of what she protected to the end. That version will not be released. It belongs to the government now, the same government that photographed her at Dulles and processed her into the federal system and eventually let her go. What remains public is a woman in a white dress on a wooden stage, a man watching from a crowd, and everything that followed. Most of it undocumented, all of it real, none of it finished.